One of the biggest mistakes that I see founders make when they're doing between $30,000 and $100,000 a month is trying to hand off sales before the foundation is there. Instead of getting their time back and watching revenue grow, they end up in this cycle where revenue just bounces up and down, margins are razor thin, and they're just running around trying to hold everything together with no time to actually build a business. And I've seen this pattern repeat more times than I can count. So what I'm gonna break down in this video, based on what we keep seeing across the teams that we build and run, is why you as a founder need to master founder-led sales before you build a team around yourself. And then how to think about stepping out of the day-to-day in the right order and what hires to make and when, so that you can get to consistent six-figure months with the foundation actually in place to scale past that. And my name is Bendik. I run Closing Consulting, where we build, staff, and run entire sales operations for high-ticket info, coaching, and service businesses. And we have closed well into 8 figures in collective revenue across our teams. And on this channel, I'm just trying to share what's working, what isn't, and what are we actively doing inside of the sales operation that we either help build or actively manage. My goal with these videos is very, very simple. I just want to document the lessons we learn, attract top-tier talents to our team, and of course, get the right partners by first demonstrating our competence. And if you're a business owner who's curious to see what we can do to help plug the leaks in your sales operation and grow your revenue, then you can head to closingconsulting.io or check the link in the description. Now, let's dive in. So let's start with the part that most people want to skip. And let me actually make the case for why you shouldn't. So the reason why founder-led sales is such a critical stage has nothing to do with enjoying sales or being naturally good at it. It's because if you haven't built the sales process yourself, what you have is not a process at all. You're just winging it. And you can bring someone else onto your team and ask them to just wing it. It's not going to work. But here's something that most founders don't think about. It's not just about the sales process, because when you go through enough reps yourself, you start to understand why people buy and why they don't, who is a good lead and who isn't, and what are the questions that come up on every single call that should have been answered in the marketing before they ever booked a call. And what objections keep showing up tells you that something is missing in how you're positioning the offer. That's not just sales knowledge. That is the foundation of your entire customer acquisition process. Your marketing and your sales process has to work together. And the best way to figure out how your marketing needs to improve is to personally talk to the leads that are coming through it. And if you skip this stage and just hand it off to someone before you have had these conversations yourself, trust me, you are flying blind in both departments at the same time. And every single client that we have worked with that scaled well, the ones that got to $300,000 and $500,000 a month and beyond without the wheels of the business coming off, had this in common early on. The founder understood that they had to be the first good salesperson for their own offer. They knew the offer better than anyone, which made it easier to sell. And they might not have been the most technically skilled closer in the world. Maybe they didn't know every framework and tactic. Maybe their rejection handling wasn't perfect, but they had a consistent enough close rate that they could say, if I take a certain number of calls this week, I'm going to produce roughly this much revenue. And that predictability is the foundation of customer acquisition. It means you can spend money on ads with a reasonable expectation of what actually comes back. And without it, you don't have a business that can scale. You just have a revenue number that goes up and down for reasons that nobody fully understands. And without that foundation, you're trying to outsource one of the most critical capabilities in the business before you have proven it to yourself. And you hear all the time that you should bring in people who are better than you and let them run things. And that is true, but the order here matters. You get good first, you prove the process works, and then you bring in people who are stronger closers than you, and you can take what you built and push it further. Because asking someone to come in and just fix a broken sales process you haven't figured out yourself is not a reasonable ask. It never works. And if you do find someone willing to take that on, you're gonna have to give up so much of the revenue to make it worth their while that the economics just stop making sense entirely. And this is actually one of the criteria that we use at Closing Consulting when we decide whether to take on a done-for-you client or not. Because if the founder cannot close the offer themselves, we're not even gonna touch it. Not as a rule for its own sake, but because we have learned that a closer is an amplifier. They take something that is already working and they've run it harder. And if the thing doesn't work yet, adding a closer is just going to add cost and pressure on top of an unsolved problem. So what does it actually mean to crack the code as a founder? Well, here are 3 things that we look for that you can use as a roadmap for yourself. And the first is that your calls follow a repeatable and intentional structure. Now, there's this famous saying that if you can't explain something to a 5-year-old, you don't understand it well enough. And I think that applies perfectly here, because most founders, when you ask them to describe their sales process, say something like, well, here's what usually works for me. And then they describe like a slightly different conversation every time, depending on how the call felt. But that is just simply not a process. It has to be something you have figured out step by step, deliberately. What do you say in the first 2 minutes? How do you run discovery? When you transition to the pitch, how you handle the close, you need to be able to explain each part clearly enough that someone else could learn it from you. Because if you cannot do that yet, You're just not ready to hand it off. And the second thing you need is what we call statistical significance. And let me explain what that means, because it sounds more complicated than what it is. Now, dialing in your process is not about how long you spend doing sales calls yourself. It's not about grinding through 6 months or a year before you're allowed to hire anyone. It's about figuring out what are your conversion rates at each step of the process with enough repetitions behind them that you can actually trust those numbers. That's all that statistical significance means. Now, if you take 2 calls and close one of them, you can't really say you have a 50% close rate. That's just a good day. But if you take 200 calls and close 100 of them, now you can finally say it, because the data has enough repetition behind it to be reliable. So the faster you can get through a high volume of calls and get a consistent result, the faster you'll know what your process is actually producing, and also what are the benchmarks a closer should be expected to hit once they come in. Now, the third thing that we look for is whether, when a call doesn't close, the founder actually understands why it didn't close. And not just the surface level sense, but they've actually identified the common reasons why deals fall apart and remove the ones that shouldn't exist. If people are regularly saying things like, I haven't seen any social proof from you, or I'm not fully sure what you guys actually do, those are not closing problems. Those are marketing and positioning problems that are showing up on the call because they were not handled earlier in the process. And so the founder's job is to identify those patterns and fix them upstream, so the closer is not dealing with avoidable friction on every single call. And lastly, what you need is numbers that tell you what exactly is happening in the process. You need basic KPI tracking in place. And you would not believe how often I talk to founders who are even doing multiple 6 figures a month, and they have either no tracking in place or something built once and they don't open it, they don't use it, they don't know their numbers. And this is business 101, I know it is, but it constantly gets skipped. Usually because the founders don't really understand how to use the numbers to actually drive decision making. And I have another video that goes deeper on exactly what KPIs to track and how to use them. So I'll link that somewhere here on the screen or in the description below. But at a minimum, you need to know how many leads it takes to produce a booked call, how many booked calls to produce a show, and how many shows to produce a close. And then also, how much of every dollar that you actually contract in revenue do you collect? And if you don't know these numbers, you have no benchmarks. And if you have no benchmarks, when you bring in a salesperson, you have nothing to hand them. You cannot tell them what good looks like. You can't tell them if they're underperforming. And you can't tell the difference between a person problem and a system problem. So the benchmarks you build as the founder are what makes it possible to actually manage anyone after you hire. All right, so you built the process, you have the numbers, and the problem is starting to shift from does this work to I don't have enough hours in the day to keep doing all of this. And that is the signal to start stepping out, and it actually makes sense to do so. But here's where most founders make a second big mistake, and it's almost as costly as the first one. They go from founder-led sales is working well directly to I'm not going to be involved in the sales process anymore. And what happens is that revenue drops. They don't know why. They panic, and then they end back up on the calls anyway, but now with more overhead, more confusion, more people on the team, and just less control than what they had before. And the way that actually works is gradual and deliberate. And there's a difference between delegation and abdication. So delegation is handing something off, staying close enough to it to make sure that it's working and only moving once it's stable. Abdication is hiring someone and just walking away. And the second approach is where most of the horror stories actually come from. So the right way to think about stepping out of sales is to look at everything you're doing and ask, what is the piece of this that is least dependent on me specifically? What is the easiest thing to hand off with the least amount of context and training required? And you hand that off first. You make sure it's working. And then you do it again with the next thing. And you work your way up from easiest to hardest, and you stay involved until each stage of what you handed off is stable before you move on to the next one. And the reason this works is that at no point are you betting the entire revenue of the business on a single hire or a single handoff. Instead, you're moving carefully, one step at a time, making sure each piece is solid before you let go of the next one. If you think about what this sales process actually consists of, it generally breaks down into 2 categories. So there's the front end work that happens before a call, reaching leads, qualifying them, booking calls, confirming them, keeping the calendar clean, etc. And then there's a closing that happens on the call itself. And so the front end work is generally the easiest thing to systemize and hand off first. It requires less judgment, less deep knowledge of an offer, and the consequences of a mistake are easier to catch and correct. Now the closing is the harder thing to hand off because it requires real skill, real knowledge of the offer, and the ability to handle unpredictable conversations. So that's where you start. And that's exactly why your first hire should be a setter, not a closer. So your first hire in almost every case should be a setter, not a closer. And before I explain what a setter does, let me explain what problem they actually solve, because I think this is where the value of this hire becomes really, really obvious. So think about everything you're currently doing around sales calls that isn't actually selling, like following up with leads, booked a call and then went quiet, showing up to calls where nobody actually shows up to talk to you, sitting through conversations with people who were never qualified to buy in the first place, rescheduling appointments, confirming appointments, calling leads and setting appointments, updating the CRM. Like none of that is actually generating money. All of it is just eating your time. And if you're anything like most founders in this range, that stuff is probably taking up more of your week than the actual sales calls are. So a setter's job is just to strip most of that out. They call the inbound leads quickly, qualify them against simple standards, book the right ones onto your calendar, confirm calls, cancel the ones that aren't going to show, and then work no-shows and old leads systematically. And what that does in practice is just remove a huge amount of wasted time from your week without actually reducing the revenue generating activity at all. Now here's a way to think about it. If you have 20 calls on your calendar in a week and only 12 of them are going to show up, and of those 12, only 8 are actually qualified, you're doing 20 calls worth of work to get the real output of 8 actual sessions. Now, a setter working those leads properly can then cancel the calls that we're never going to convert, keep on the confirmed qualified ones, and the result is that you might have 8 or 10 calls on your calendar instead of 20, but the revenue outcome is the same or better. You just got 30, 40, sometimes 60% of the time in your week back. Now, that said, there are situations where the setter hire is less urgent. If your funnel is working well enough that you're consistently seeing above 70% show rates and the majority of calls are coming through and being generally qualified, well, you're probably not going to feel this pain as much. But in our experience, that is actually the exception. What's far more common, like by far, is a messy front end where a lot of the leads never book a call. A lot of the calls that do get booked just don't show. And a meaningful percentage of the ones that do show up should not have been on the calendar in the first place. Now, if that sounds familiar, a setter is probably the right move for you. So the big question is, when does this hire make sense? And for what we've seen, you're usually ready when you're somewhere in that $30,000 to $80,000 a month range. The offer is working in the sense that when you have qualified calls on the calendar, you can actually close them. And the main constraint is front-end chaos and just your own time. For example, being slow on speed to lead, you're not following up on all leads, calls are not being confirmed properly, etc. It's just a meaningful chunk of your week is going to things that have nothing to do with selling. And one thing is worth saying directly. If you're doing $10,000 to $15,000 a month or anything around that, and you're taking like 3 calls a week, you do not need a setter. You need just more demand, just working and working. Because hiring into that situation just adds more overhead, there's more complications, and you're just gonna spend your time on something that's not actually solving the problem. And when you do bring one in, just keep the setup very simple. Give them a clear priority order for who to contact, like new self-books and fresh applications first, then recent no-shows and reschedules, and then older leads by recency. So give them a short script with 3 to 5 qualification questions and clear rules on who belongs on the calendar and who doesn't. And set confirmation standards so every call is touched the day before and the morning of. And track a handful of KPIs from day one, like new conversation started, calls booked, and show rate on the calls at the book. And by the way, I have other videos that go deeper on how to actually hire a setter and how to structure the day-to-day. So don't worry about that for now. You can go watch those after. The point of this section is just I want you to understand the concept of when this hire actually makes sense and why it becomes before hiring a closer. Now, the goal at this stage is not a perfect system. It's to free you up so that when you are on calls, you're present. You're working a full pipeline of qualified people, and you're not burned out from doing 2 jobs at once. And once that combination of you closing and a setter feeding you qualified calls is working and pushing toward $80,000 to $100,000 a month, the closer hire makes a lot more sense. Now, I do want to be clear on something before we get into this. I'm not saying you shouldn't hire a closer. Like, you absolutely have to at some point, because that's the only way you can truly step out of sales and scale. In a closing consulting, running closer teams is most of what we do for our done-for-you clients. But we see this specific pattern again and again where founders just hire them too early, and it's worth understanding what that actually costs you before you make that move. And the first thing to get clear on is the economics. And I want to be direct about this because I've seen founders badly underestimate how much it actually matters. Now, every single closer, like literally every single one of them that I have ever interviewed, and I've interviewed quite a lot of them, ask the same questions before they decide if they want to consider your offer or not. So they asked, what is the OTE, meaning the on-target earnings? What are the other closers on the team currently making? What's the revenue of the business? And what does it look like over the last 3 to 6 months? And they are asking these things because they are taking a gamble on you the same way that you are taking a gamble on them. Because if a closer joins your team and 3 months later, they've barely closed anything because the volume isn't there or the process just isn't dialed in, they haven't just had a bad quarter. They've lost the opportunity cost of what they could have been making working with another offer that was actually right for them. And for a good closer, that could be $30,000 or more in lost earnings. And so a good closer is just not going to take that risk lightly. So if you can't show a clear path to a closer making at least $10,000 a month, most of the strong ones are just gonna pass. And let me be clear about what that actually means in practice. If a closer is earning 10% on cash collected, getting them to 10K a month requires roughly $100,000 a month flowing through them. That's the floor, not the ceiling. That's the minimum to even be in a conversation with someone worth hiring. Without that, you don't attract nobody. You attract people who are comfortable with low volume and unclear systems. And that is not who you want representing your offer on calls. The mistake founders make here is thinking this is a recruiting problem. They think if they could just sell the opportunity better or find the right person willing to take a chance, it'll work out. But the real solution is not to become a better recruiter, it's to make the opportunity genuinely worth taking by improving the economics of the business first. So dial in the marketing, push the revenue up, and get a setter in place. Because when you go out looking for a closer, and you can tell them that all they need to do is to show up to a calendar of pre-confirmed, pre-qualified calls and just close, that is a serious selling point. And strong closers want to spend their time closing. They don't want to spend their time chasing leads and confirming calls. And if you have a setter handling all of that, you just made your opportunity meaningfully more attractive than what most of what they will find elsewhere. So when does the closer hire actually make sense? Again, from what we've seen, it works best when the founder and setter together are doing $70,000 to $100,000 a month, and you can consistently put 15 to 20 qualified calls per week on the closer's calendar. You also need to have a call framework written down with objection handling that you've personally tested, recordings of you closing the offer that someone can actually learn from, and the business can absorb a 1 to 2 month ramp period where the new closer is still learning and not yet at full output. And so at that point, you're inviting someone into a machine that's already producing. You have the volume that makes the opportunity worth their time, you have a baseline for them to measure against, and you're not asking them to figure something out yet that hasn't been done. And what do you actually look for in that first closer? Well, someone who has closed similar ticket sizes before, who can operate inside a structure rather than just rewrite everything from day one, who gives you honest feedback from calls, and who wants to be part of building something rather than just picking off the easiest wins. And don't expect them to outperform you in month 1. Month 1 is most about learning and shadowing and taking calls while you're listening in. By months 2 to 3, you want to see them approaching your numbers on key metrics. Beyond that, a good closer in a well-run system often does surpass the founder eventually, because closing is their entire job rather than just one part of it. And if after a fair ramp period, they're stuck at half your performance, that's either a fit problem or there's still a system issues that lead quality or show rate just hasn't been solved. But again, the numbers will tell you which one it is, which is exactly why having that tracking in place from stage 1 matters so much when you get here. And one more thing worth covering here is how you actually onboard that first closer, because this is where a lot of founders also go wrong. So when a new closer starts, you do not hand them 100% of the calls. You start by giving them maybe 20% of the volume while you continue taking the rest yourself. And so every call they take, you want them reviewing the recording and sending it to you. And at this stage, the closer should be spending more time listening back to their own calls, self-coaching and getting coached by you than they are actually doing taking calls. And that's what the ramp period looks like in practice. Not throwing them into the deep end and hoping for the best. And then as they get better, you gradually hand them a bigger and bigger percentage of the volume. And this is easy to manage with Calendly or other booking softwares through something called round robins. And here you can set exactly what percentage of incoming calls go to you versus them. So you might start at 80-20 in your favor and then move to 60-40 and then 50-50. And then at each stage, you're comparing results. So close rate, cash collected per call, and all these other key metrics. And once you're confident that the numbers are holding up, you make the decision to move the majority of the volume over to them. And you want to do this as fast as possible, not because you're in a rush to get off calls, but because the faster they are at full capacity, the faster they're making real money, and that's what keeps good people around. And then from there, as your closers' calendars fill up and the utilization numbers start telling you that there's more demand than one person can handle, you can start thinking about adding more people to the team. But that's a whole separate conversation. And I have other videos that go into exactly how to think about scaling from there. So to pull this whole thing together, the sequence we keep seeing work is this. The founder cracks the sales process, gets basic tracking in place, and builds the right benchmarks. And then a setter comes in to take those front-end chaos off the founder's plate and actually just make sure that calls that do happen are worth having. And once that combination is pushing towards $100,000 a month, a closer gets plugged into a system that's already producing, and you can start ramping up. It's almost like playing a video game, where before you can move to the next level, you have to finish the current one and build the right foundation, because otherwise you're not equipped to compete at the next level. And it's the same thing here. If you skip a stage or you rush through it before the foundation is solid, when you try to advance, everything is just gonna start to crack, and the cycle of just unpredictable revenue and chaos is just gonna keep repeating itself and end back up at square one with more overhead than when you started with. And the clients that we work with who scaled well without major revenue volatility all followed something close to this sequence. Now, whether you're still in the founder-led phase or you're trying to build a real sales operation and you want help taking those steps, or you're already past $100,000 a month and you're ready to scale, but you don't want to be the one managing that whole operation yourself, go check out what we do at Closing Consulting. All we do is help businesses with high ticket offers structure, build, and operate sales operations that actually take the business to the next level. And if you want to see specifically what we do and how we work, head to closingconsulting.io or just check the link in the description. You can book a free audit of your current sales operation there. And we're going to walk you through where you are, where the gaps are, and actually put together a custom plan for your business specifically, showing exactly how we would approach scaling your sales operation if we were to step in. And if you just want to keep learning, there's a lot more content on this channel covering all of this in detail, so go check that out. And if you're a seller or a closer who wants to work inside of a team like ours that already has all this in place, the application link to join our team is down there as well.